What if I told you that the most feared empire in history was not built on wealth or cities or even technology, but on a boy abandoned in the wilderness who turned hunger into power and despair into destiny? This is the untold beginning of Genghis Khan. Temujin's story does not begin with a throne or with riches. It begins with exile, hunger, and betrayal. Born around 1167, he was the son of Yasuge, a respected tribal leader who held influence over the nomadic clans of Mongolia. For a brief moment, his path seemed clear. He was heir to leadership, tied to bloodlines of power. But destiny shattered early. At only 9 years old, Temujin's father was poisoned by rival Tatars. In an instant, the boy's future collapsed. His mother, Hoylun, was left to care for 7 children alone, stripped of protection, cast out by their own tribe. They were left to wander the steppe, a land of extremes where survival was uncertain even for the strongest. Summers scorched the earth with blistering heat, while winters froze rivers solid and killed men in their sleep. For Temujin's family, this was not just hardship, it was a death sentence. The boy learned the taste of hunger before he learned the weight of command. With no cattle or allies, Temujin and his siblings scavenged for roots, hunted small rodents, and at times drank the blood of their horses to stay alive. These lessons, brutal and raw, etched themselves into his memory. One day, he would teach his warriors the same survival techniques on campaigns stretching across continents. But even as a child, Temujin displayed something different. While others broke under the cruelty of exile, he grew sharper. He fought with his half-brother for dominance, learning the painful truth that leadership required both fear and respect. He learned to bend fate by forging bonds where none seemed possible. It was in these years that he first met Berta, the woman who would become his wife and his most loyal ally. Their union was not only of affection, but of strategy. In the steppe, marriage was politics, and politics was survival. Together, they would form the foundation of alliances that would change history. Temujin's earliest stroke of political genius came not with an army, but with a gift, a black sable cloak. To outsiders, it was just fur. To the Mongols, it was a symbol of prestige and power. He offered it to the leader of the Karate tribe, securing an ally far stronger than himself. It was a lesson that would define his rise. Power was not taken only by the sword, but by loyalty, debt, and trust. But fate tested him again. Not long after his marriage, disaster struck. The Merkite tribe, enemies from the north, raided Temujin's camp. They captured Berta, tearing her from his arms. For many men, this would have meant surrender. For Temujin, it was the spark of war. Calling upon the alliances he had forged, he rallied his allies and reminded them of debts owed to his father. What followed was a daring raid against the Merkite, fire, steel, and vengeance in the night. Berta was rescued, and Temujin emerged stronger than ever. His reputation grew beyond the steppes. Here was not just a boy who survived exile, but a man who commanded loyalty, avenged dishonor, and bent destiny to his will. From exile to redemption, from hunger to power, Temujin's rise had only just begun. What came next would turn this survivor into the storm the world would never forget. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Mongolian steppe was a patchwork of tribes locked in endless cycles of blood feuds and betrayal. Rival clans shifted alliances as quickly as the seasons. For generations, unity had been impossible. But Temujin, no longer just a boy of exile, saw opportunity where others saw chaos. His rise was slow, built not only through war, but through calculated loyalty. He did not rely solely on kinship, as tradition dictated. Instead, he rewarded talent. Warriors who served with courage were promoted regardless of bloodline. To the steppe, this was radical. To Temujin, it was common sense. By creating an army bound not by birth, but by merit, he began to forge something greater than a tribe. He was forging a nation. Discipline became his signature. Unlike other chieftains, he forbade looting while enemies still resisted. Those who disobeyed were punished severely, their spoils confiscated. This was more than cruelty, it was order. For the first time, the chaos of the steppes was being shaped into a machine of war. His vision attracted followers. Clans tired of betrayal found in Temujin a leader who demanded loyalty but also offered stability. By 1201, he had defeated rival leaders in battle after battle, and by 1206, his authority was unchallenged. In a great assembly known as the Kurultai, the scattered tribes of the steppe gathered. On that day, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The moment was more than a coronation. It was the birth of an empire. Witnesses described him as tall, with a powerful frame, broad shoulders, and eyes of gray-green fire. His mere presence silenced men. Songs called him the Oceanic Khan, a man whose power was as vast as the sea itself. To friend and foe alike, his new name carried both awe and dread. But the title of Genghis Khan was more than symbolism. It was legitimacy. For centuries, the steppe had been fractured, but now the tribes had a single supreme leader. Under him, loyalty meant survival, and betrayal meant annihilation. Those who joined him were rewarded with wealth and protection. Those who defied him were erased. And so, in 1206, the world changed. Out of the frozen winds of Mongolia rose a storm unlike any before. Genghis Khan was no longer the boy who had once scavenged for roots in exile. He was the architect of a new order, a leader whose ambitions would stretch far beyond the steppe. His gaze now turned outward, toward empires far richer, far older, and far more powerful. His message was clear. The age of Mongol supremacy had begun. By the time Genghis Khan had united the tribes of Mongolia, his eyes were already fixed on a far greater prize: China. To the Mongols, the Chinese kingdoms represented wealth beyond imagination: silk, porcelain, grain, and the treasures of ancient dynasties. But they also represented something Temujin had never faced before: towering fortresses and cities fortified by stone. The steppe had shaped the Mongols into masters of mobility and cavalry warfare, but against walls, horsemen were powerless. At first, the nomadic warriors hurled themselves against gates, unable to break them. They were like a storm striking stone cliffs, terrifying but ineffective. Genghis Khan, however, was no ordinary leader. Where others would have seen an end, he saw an opportunity to adapt. He captured Chinese engineers and artisans, men who knew the secrets of siege warfare. Instead of killing them, he put them to work. They built catapults, siege towers, and primitive bombs of gunpowder. For the first time in Mongol history, an army of horsemen was accompanied by engines of war. The transformation was dramatic. Cities that once believed themselves untouchable found their walls crumbling under the assault of machines. The Mongols learned to use fire, to collapse defenses, and even to flood cities by diverting rivers. Every new conquest taught them a lesson, and every lesson made them more dangerous. In 1209, the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia fell. By 1211, Genghis had turned his fury on the Jin dynasty. Battles stretched across the plains, and the Mongols advanced relentlessly, striking like lightning. Their speed was unmatched, but now their ingenuity matched it. The Great Wall slowed them, but could not stop them. Gate after gate opened, fortress after fortress fell. In 1214, the Jin emperor was forced to surrender, offering gold, silk, and even a daughter in marriage to buy peace. But peace with the Mongols was always temporary. Soon after, Beijing itself was sacked, its wealth carried away, its people scattered. For the first time, the world realized that the Mongols were not just raiders. They were conquerors of civilizations. What made Genghis unique was not his brutality, but his pragmatism. He absorbed the strengths of his enemies. He valued knowledge as much as power. Each time he conquered a city, he spared its artisans, scholars, and engineers. Instead of rejecting foreign innovations, he adopted them. This was not the mind of a barbarian. It was the mind of a visionary. The Chinese campaigns were more than conquest. They were transformation. In the crucible of war, the Mongols evolved from scattered horsemen into an empire that could challenge the oldest civilizations on Earth. The storm of the steppe had learned to break walls. In the West, the Mongols faced not just armies, but arrogance. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across Persia, was wealthy, proud, and convinced of its strength. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, believed that nomadic horsemen could never challenge the might of his cities. That belief would cost him his empire. At first, relations seemed promising. Genghis Khan sent caravans of merchants seeking trade and diplomacy. But suspicion poisoned the Shah's court. Fearing spies, his governor and Otrar executed the Mongol envoys, slaughtering merchants and humiliating the Khan's authority. Diplomats sent to negotiate were killed as well, an insult no nomadic leader could ignore. When news reached Genghis, his reaction was chillingly simple. You chose war. What happens next, happens. It was not a threat, it was a promise. And the storm began to move west. The Mongol invasion of Persia was unlike anything the region had ever seen. Armies of horsemen descended like a tide, moving faster than warnings could spread. Their discipline was merciless. Cities that resisted were annihilated, populations slaughtered. Those that surrendered quickly were spared, at least in part. Terror was not a side effect of Mongol warfare. It was a deliberate weapon. In 1219, Bukhara, one of the jewels of Islam, faced the storm. Chroniclers describe the moment as unforgettable. The Mongols breached the walls, and Genghis himself entered the city's great mosque. Climbing the pulpit, he declared not prayers, but judgment. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. For the people of Bukhara, it was not just conquest, it was apocalypse. From Bukhara to Samarkand, the devastation spread. Fortresses that had stood for centuries fell within days. Cities were reduced to smoldering ruins. Survivors told tales of slaughter so complete that entire regions were depopulated. Refugees fled westward carrying stories that spread terror before the Mongols even arrived.
This was psychological warfare unscathed. The world was snow. Entire cities surrendered without a fight, choosing submission over annihilation. The Mongols had mastered the art of conquering with fear alone.
But behind the brutality was cold strategy. By eliminating resistance quickly and brutally, Genghis ensured that future campaigns would face less opposition. By sparing artisans, engineers, and scholars, he enriched his empire with talent. The Mongols were not destroyers without purpose. They were builders of a war machine fueled by both terror and pragmatism. The Shah himself fled in panic, abandoning his capital and wandering in exile until he died on an island in the Caspian Sea. The empire he ruled, once confident and proud, had been erased in a matter of years. The Persian disaster revealed to the world that Genghis Khan was more than a conqueror of tribes. He was now a conqueror of empires, and his message was carved in fire. Those who defied him would not just lose battles, they would lose everything. The Mongol warrior was not just a soldier, he was a survival machine. From childhood, boys were taught to ride before they could walk steadily. By the age of 4, they could fire a bow from horseback with startling precision. By 10, they were hunting, fighting mock battles, and living as if every day were preparation for war. The steppe was their school, and war their final exam. Each warrior traveled with multiple horses, rotating mounts to preserve their stamina. This gave them unmatched mobility, allowing them to cover up to 100 kilometers a day, distances unthinkable for other medieval armies. A Mongol unit could vanish into the horizon and reappear days later behind enemy lines, striking like a phantom army. Their bows were masterpieces of composite design, made of wood, horn, and sinew. Small enough to fire from horseback, yet powerful enough to pierce armor at 300 meters. In their quivers, they carried arrows for every purpose. Light arrows for range, heavy ones for armor, and even incendiary arrows to spread chaos. A rain of arrows from Mongol horsemen was like a storm, relentless, precise, and terrifying. But weapons were only part of the secret. Their discipline set them apart. The army was structured in a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Orders flowed seamlessly, and disobedience was punished harshly. If one man fled, his entire unit could be executed. Fear bound them together as tightly as loyalty. Training was constant. The Great Hunt, a massive ritual disguised as tradition, gathered thousands of warriors in a coordinated encirclement of wild animals. It was more than hunting. It was practice for war. Soldiers learned to move as one, to encircle, to trap, to annihilate. The lessons of the hunt would later be unleashed against armies of men. Even their clothing served survival. Warriors wore silk undershirts beneath their armor. When pierced by an arrow, the silk wrapped around the arrowhead, making it easier to pull out and reducing deadly internal injuries. They carried dried meat, curd, and water bags that doubled as flotation devices for river crossings. A Mongol warrior could survive alone for days without supply lines. Perhaps the most devastating weapon, however, was psychological. News of Mongol cruelty traveled faster than their horses. Tales of massacres and burning cities broke the will of resistance before battles began. Entire towns surrendered at the mere sight of dust clouds rising on the horizon, knowing what awaited those who defied the Khan. The Mongol war machine was more than men on horses. It was discipline, innovation, and terror, woven together into a single unstoppable storm. To face them was not just to fight an enemy, it was to stand against a force of nature. In 1221, the Mongol storm reached the banks of the Indus River. Jalal ad-Din, heir of the shattered Khwarezmian Empire, had gathered what remained of his forces, a desperate army, battered by defeat, yet still burning with the will to resist. For the first time in years, the Mongols were outnumbered. Jalal commanded 50,000 men against Genghis Khan's 40,000. On paper, the advantage was his, but wars are not won on parchment. Genghis knew that numbers meant nothing without strategy. As dawn broke, the two armies faced one another across the river valley. The Persians struck first, their cavalry surging forward with thunderous momentum. For a moment, it seemed the Mongols were faltering, driven back by sheer force. Cries of victory rose from Jalal's men, but it was all part of the plan. What appeared to be weakness was bait. Genghis had deliberately stretched his lines, drawing the Persians deeper into his formation. As the Khwarezmian army pressed forward, the trap snapped shut. Hidden Mongol units emerged from the hills, charging into the enemy's exposed flanks. Panic spread like fire in dry grass. The battle dissolved into chaos. The Persians, once confident, now found themselves encircled, their retreat cut off. Jalal fought bravely, leading charges with his personal guard. But even courage was powerless against Mongol precision. As his men fell around him, the Shah realized the truth. He had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and outwitted. In desperation, Jalal broke free with a handful of survivors, galloping toward the river. Behind him, his family tried to escape, but the Mongols showed no mercy. Chroniclers write that his young sons were seized and thrown into the rushing waters of the Indus. Jalal watched helplessly as the river swallowed his bloodline. He crossed to the far side, alive but broken, a fugitive haunted by loss. For Genghis, it was total victory. Yet even this triumph carried shadows. The battle at the Indus was not just the destruction of an enemy army. It was a brutal reminder of how conquest scars both victor and vanquished. To the Persians, it was tragedy. To the Mongols, it was destiny fulfilled. And to history, it was one of the most ruthless ambushes ever conceived. By the 1230s, the Mongol Empire stretched farther than any had thought possible. Yet Genghis Khan was gone, and it was his descendants who carried the storm westward. Led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and guided by the brilliant General Subutai, the Mongols turned their gaze toward Europe. The first to feel the weight of this invasion were the Russian principalities. Fragmented, proud, and deeply divided, they stood no chance against an enemy that moved with the speed of lightning and the precision of a blade. In 1237, Ryazan was the first city to fall. Its walls collapsed under Mongol siege engines, and its people were slaughtered without mercy. From Moscow to Vladimir, cities burned, each one reduced to ash as the Mongols carved their path across the land. The terror was deliberate. Word spread faster than the horsemen themselves. Refugees carried stories of annihilation. Entire towns wiped from the map, populations erased. When emissaries of the Khan appeared before a city, demanding surrender, the choice was grim but clear: submit or face extermination. Many chose submission. Those who resisted faced extinction. But the true target lay farther west, Europe itself. In 1241, as snow melted across the plains, the Mongols launched their grand assault. Their strategy was brilliant and terrifying. While one army swept through Poland, defeating knights at Legnica, the main force stormed into Hungary. Subutai led a daring march through the Carpathian Mountains, a route thought impossible. Emerging on the other side, the Mongols fell upon the Hungarian plains like a storm. King Bélaförk of Hungary believed his numbers and fortifications would save him. He gathered nearly 100,000 men, including knights, nobles, and foreign allies. For a brief moment, Europe hoped the Mongols would finally be stopped, but Subutai had set a trap. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarians marched directly into it. The Mongols staged a feigned retreat, luring their enemies into overconfidence. Then, in the dead of night, they struck from all sides. Siege engines hurled flaming projectiles into the Hungarian camp. Arrows rained without mercy. Horses panicked, men screamed, and the battlefield dissolved into slaughter. By dawn, the Hungarian army was shattered. Tens of thousands lay dead. Poland burned, Hungary bled, and Austria lay open. Europe trembled on the brink of collapse. Chroniclers wrote that had the Mongols continued westward, nothing could have stopped them from reaching the Atlantic. But then, as suddenly as they had come, they turned back. The great Khan Ogedei had died in Mongolia, and Batu Khan was summoned home for the succession. Europe was spared, not by strength, but by chance. For the people of Europe, it was a miracle. For the Mongols, it was unfinished business. The message was clear. If they chose to return, no wall, no kingdom, no army could stop them. By the time the Mongol tide began to slow, the empire Genghis Khan had built was the largest the world had ever seen. From the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, from the steppes of Mongolia to the sands of Persia, his banners cast a shadow over civilizations old and new. But the legacy of Genghis Khan is not simple. To some, he remains the embodiment of cruelty, a conqueror whose armies left smoking ruins, mass graves, and rivers of blood. To others, he was a visionary, a man who united a fractured steppe and built an empire on merit, discipline, and relentless ambition. He was ruthless, yes, but he was also pragmatic. He spared artisans, scholars, and engineers, integrating them into his empire. He valued religious tolerance, allowing Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists alike to worship freely. He created one of the earliest postal systems, linking the vastness of Asia with roads and stations that carried news at lightning speed. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, protected by the Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols. Even centuries later, his bloodline still echoes. Genetic studies suggest that millions across Asia carry his DNA, a haunting reminder of the scale of his influence. Genghis Khan's true legacy is paradox. He was both destroyer and builder, tyrant and visionary, feared barbarian and brilliant strategist. His conquests redrew the map of the world and shaped history in ways still felt today. When he died in 1227, his burial site was kept secret. Legends say that rivers were diverted over his grave, and that those who built the tomb were executed to preserve the mystery. No one knows where the conqueror rests. Perhaps that is fitting, for Genghis Khan does not belong to one land or one people. His legacy belongs to history itself, eternal, vast, and terrifying. So was Genghis Khan a monster or a genius, a barbarian or a visionary? Perhaps the truth lies in the paradox, that he was both. His empire brought terror, but it also brought order. His shadow still stretches across history, a reminder of how one man can change the world forever. What do you think? Was Genghis Khan history's greatest conqueror, or its greatest villain? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to keep uncovering the untold stories that shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and watch our next episode, where we dive into the mysteries of another empire that rose and fell in blood and glory.